He was seen as a model father, but he hid a world of lies behind his own success. His wife discovered everything and, in silence, orchestrated a perfect and irreversible escape. Now, alone and with nothing, he understands that the one who truly holds a home together doesn't always make a sound. If this story caught your interest, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and let us know what city you're watching from. Let's continue. Richard Miller's life was a flawless storefront window. At 42, he had achieved everything New York society considered success. A partner at one of the largest financial consulting firms on Wall Street, he moved between strategic meetings, corporate dinners, and exclusive events where his name was spoken with respect and admiration. His Italian suits fit his shoulders perfectly, his Swiss watch gleamed under the ballroom lights, and his broad smile won over clients and investors as easily as he signed multi-million-dollar contracts. Richard was the kind of man who seemed born for that world. He spoke 3 languages fluently, quoted works of art as casually as someone discussing the latest NFL scores, and had the rare ability to make anyone feel like they were the most important person in the room when he turned his attention to them. In New York, the city that never sleeps and values those who climb rung by rung to the top, Richard was seen as a natural-born winner. But Richard's life, like any well-arranged storefront, hid what was behind the gleaming glass. In their spacious Upper West Side apartment, with a view of the park and decor by a renowned designer, lived Beatrice. His wife of 6 years, a woman of understated beauty and natural elegance, who seemed tailor-made for the role. Beatrice came from a traditional family, in upstate New York, had a degree in education, and her brown eyes conveyed an almost childlike sweetness. She had met Richard at a charity event where she was volunteering, and he, charmed by the combination of intelligence and kindness she exuded, courted her with the same determination he applied to his business deals. The wedding was celebrated at a historic estate in the Hudson Valley, with 200 guests, a live band, and a party that was the talk of New York's high society for months. Beatrice was the ideal wife. She managed the home perfectly, organized dinners that impressed Richard's clients, participated in charity groups, and always maintained that serene smile that made any guest feel welcome. 6 months ago, she had given birth to Gabriel, a baby boy with big eyes and rosy cheeks who became the center of her universe. Richard, busy as ever, could barely keep up with the sleepless nights, the diaper changes, the middle-of-the-night feedings. But he loved posing for pictures. He adored posting images on social media of his son in his arms, with captions about fatherhood and legacy. To the world, Richard Miller was also a present and dedicated father. The truth, however, was very different. On that rainy Thursday in June, Richard was sitting in his 23rd floor glass office, watching the grey city below, while pretending to pay attention to the presentation his partner, Andrew Fisher, was giving to a group of Japanese investors. His mind, however, was far away. It was in a compact, modern apartment in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, where Larissa was surely just waking up, stretching between the satin sheets he had bought for her. Larissa was 28, a PR specialist for an events agency, and had met Richard at a trade show 2 years ago. She was everything Beatrice was not: bold, provocative, full of energy and ambition. She wore high heels that echoed down hallways, laughed too loudly, drank whiskey neat, and wasn't afraid to say exactly what she thought. Richard felt young next to her, vibrant, as if he could conquer the world all over again. For the past 2 years, he had built a complex and meticulous routine to keep his 2 lives separate. Business trips that extended a day or 2 longer than necessary, invented late-night meetings. Weekends at conferences that never happened. Beatrice, too busy with Gabriel and with her trusting, loving nature, never questioned him. She believed him. She believed him when he said he was working so hard for the family's future. She believed him when he came home late, smelling of an expensive perfume she didn't recognize, which he explained away as being from a dinner with clients. And Larissa, for her part, believed that Richard was on the verge of getting a divorce, that it was only a matter of time before he got everything in order and could be with her publicly. She didn't know that Richard had never mentioned divorce to Beatrice, that in the Upper West Side apartment, he still slept in the same bed as his wife, still kissed her forehead in the morning, still signed loving cards on her birthday. Richard had become a master at compartmentalizing. Each world had its own rules, its own schedules, its own versions of who he was, and he believed, genuinely believed, that he could keep it all going forever. That afternoon, after the meeting with the Japanese investors, Richard took his imported car from the building's garage and drove to Williamsburg. Larissa was waiting for him in a tight dress and a mischievous smile. They had dinner at a small, discreet restaurant, far from the places where Richard was usually recognized. They talked about a trip she wanted to take to Europe, and Richard promised that soon they could go together, out in the open. It was an empty promise, but he repeated it whenever necessary to keep Larissa happy. When he returned home, it was already past 11 at night. Beatrice was in the living room with Gabriel sleeping in his stroller beside her, watching a series on TV. She looked up when Richard walked in, and her smile was so genuine that he felt a strange pang in his chest, a feeling he preferred to ignore. "Hey, honey," Beatrice said, pausing the TV. "Long meeting tonight?" Richard loosened his tie and nodded, tossing his jacket on the sofa. Those Japanese investors are beyond meticulous. Andrew almost had a meltdown trying to explain the numbers for the third time. Beatrice chuckled softly, getting up to hug him. "You must be exhausted. Want me to heat up dinner? I made that lasagna you like." "No need. I grabbed a bite with the team after the meeting." Another lie. One more on the endless pile of lies. That held up his house of cards. Beatrice accepted it without question, as always. She picked up Gabriel and walked toward the nursery, whispering a lullaby. Richard stood there, watching her disappear down the hall, and for a brief moment he wondered what would happen if she found out the truth. But he quickly pushed the thought away. Beatrice was predictable. Beatrice was stable. She would never suspect a thing. In the following days, the routine continued as usual. Richard moved between his office, the Upper West Side apartment, and his secret rendezvous with Larissa. Beatrice took care of Gabriel, organized the house, and maintained the domestic harmony that Richard had come to take for granted. She seemed happy. She smiled while making breakfast, hummed while folding the baby's clothes, and hugged Richard warmly before he left for work. But there was something almost imperceptible that Richard didn't notice because he was too busy with his own concerns. Beatrice had started asking different questions, casual questions about his schedule, about specific meetings, about names Richard mentioned. She jotted things down in a small notebook she kept in a kitchen drawer. She checked bank statements more carefully. She made phone calls when Richard wasn't around, but Richard saw none of it. To him, Beatrice was still the same docile, trusting woman he had met years ago. On a Tuesday in July, Richard received a proposal for a business trip to Miami, an important merger between two companies that could bring in millions in contracts for the firm. Andrew was thrilled with the possibility, and Richard saw the perfect opportunity to extend the trip and spend a few days with Larissa, far from New York, in a beachfront hotel where no one would know them. He came home that night with a wide grin, mentally rehearsing how he would present the trip to Beatrice. She was in the kitchen preparing vegetable puree for Gabriel and looked up when Richard entered. "I've got some news," he said, loosening his tie. "I'll need to travel to Miami next week. Big merger, it's going to require at least 5 days of intense negotiations." Beatrice continued stirring the baby food, her eyes fixed on the pot. 5 days is a long time. "Yeah, but it's a huge opportunity. If we close this deal, we can secure the company's expansion for the next year." She nodded, slowly. "When will you be back?" "Probably next Friday. I might have to stretch it to Saturday depending on how things go." Beatrice turned off the stove and faced him, with that smile Richard knew so well. "Okay. Gabriel and I will be fine here. Try to get some rest too, you've been working so hard." Richard felt an immediate sense of relief. She was so understanding, so easy to deal with. He walked over and kissed her forehead, smelling the faint scent of her shampoo. "You're amazing, you know that?" Beatrice just smiled, but there was something in her eyes at that moment that Richard couldn't decipher. Something distant, as if she were looking through him, not at him. The week flew by. Richard organized everything for the trip, confirmed the hotels, the meetings, and discreetly let Larissa know they would have those days all to themselves in Miami. She was ecstatic, already planning walks on the beach, romantic dinners and nights in the hotel's penthouse suite. On Monday morning, Richard packed his travel bag while Beatrice breastfed Gabriel in the next room. He put on his favorite grey suit, the same one he'd worn for the company's last earnings presentation, and checked that he had all the necessary documents. Beatrice appeared at the bedroom door with Gabriel in her arms and said goodbye with a long hug. "Have a good trip, honey. Call me if you need anything." Richard kissed Gabriel on the forehead, smelling the baby scent that always made him smile, and walked out the door without looking back. If he had looked back, he might have seen the expression on Beatrice's face, an expression that wasn't one of sadness or longing. It was one of determination. Miami welcomed Richard with blue skies and pleasant weather. The business meetings took up the mornings and afternoons of the first few days, but the nights were reserved for Larissa, who was staying at a hotel near his. They dined at sophisticated restaurants in South Beach, walked along the shore, and laughed like teenagers in love. Richard felt free, completely free from the responsibility that Beatrice and Gabriel represented. Here, he was just a successful man, enjoying the company of a beautiful woman. No diapers, no crying baby, no demands. On Thursday night, after a particularly pleasant dinner at a restaurant overlooking the ocean, Richard and Larissa returned to his hotel. She was excited, talking about the possibility of them moving in together soon, about how perfect it would be when he finally freed himself from the shackles of a marriage that, according to him, had been dead for years. Richard agreed with everything, murmuring promises as he opened the bottle of wine he had asked to be left in the room. But deep down, he had no intention of leaving Beatrice. Leaving Beatrice would mean dividing assets, facing lawyers, dealing with society's judgment. And worse, it would mean giving up the family man image he had so carefully cultivated. No, it was much more convenient to keep things exactly as they were. Beatrice at home taking care of their son and domestic life, Larissa as his escape valve, the adventure that made him feel young and desired. On Friday morning, Richard woke up to a call from Andrew. His partner sounded agitated on the other end of the line, speaking quickly about some documents that needed to be reviewed urgently. Richard promised to handle it as soon as he got back to New York and hung up, still sleepy. Larissa was asleep beside him, her hair spread across the pillow, and he watched her for a moment before getting up to shower. One more day of meetings, one more day of maintaining the perfect balance between his two lives. What Richard didn't know was that while he was enjoying the Miami breeze and the empty promises he made to Larissa, his life in New York was being meticulously dismantled, piece by piece, brick by brick, and when he returned, he would find nothing left of the world he knew. Beatrice was not the fragile, naive woman he imagined. She had discovered everything, every lie, every betrayal, every broken promise. And instead of confronting him with tears and screams, she had chosen a different path, a silent, calculated, and definitive path. While Richard was signing contracts in Miami, Beatrice was signing other documents in New York, documents that would change everything, forever. On Saturday afternoon, Richard finally said goodbye to Larissa and boarded his flight back to New York. The trip had been perfect, the negotiations successful. He felt refreshed, ready to get back to his routine. On the plane, while flipping through a business magazine, he allowed himself to imagine how nice it would be to get home, take a shower, maybe have dinner with Beatrice and hold Gabriel before bed. The flight landed in the late afternoon. Richard took a cab straight to the Upper West Side, eager to get rid of his heavy suitcase and relax. As he approached his building, he found it strange not to see the usual doorman at the entrance. A younger man he didn't recognize was at the post, but Richard didn't think much of it, probably a temporary replacement. He went up to the 10th floor, where his apartment was, and inserted the key into the lock. The door opened, normally, but when Richard stepped inside, his heart stopped for a second. The apartment was empty, completely empty. There was no furniture, no paintings on the walls, no rugs, curtains, or any of the objects that had decorated the space. The walls were bare, leaving only the rectangular marks where picture frames and artwork had once hung. The hardwood floor echoed his footsteps as Richard walked, stunned, through the rooms. The living room was empty. The kitchen, without utensils, appliances or anything. The master bedroom, just the cold floor and open windows letting in the orange light of dusk. Gabriel's room, where the light wood crib, the shelves of stuffed animals and the cloud-patterned curtains used to be, was now just an empty space that echoed with silence. Richard felt his legs weaken. He dropped his suitcase and walked back to the living room, trying to process what he was seeing. Beatrice, Gabriel. Everything was gone. There were no signs of a struggle, of confusion, of a mess. Just the methodical emptiness of a space that had been carefully cleared out. In the center of the empty living room, on the hardwood floor, was a white envelope. Richard bent down, picked it up with trembling hands and tore it open. Inside, a single sheet of paper with handwriting he knew well. Beatrice's delicate script. "Richard, you've probably realized we're not here anymore. Don't bother looking. Don't bother calling. I made the decision I should have made a long time ago. You underestimated me. You thought I was just a decorative wife, a woman who would silently accept anything. But I've always known everything. The lies, the betrayals, Larissa. Every night you spent away pretending to work. I know because I investigated, because I planned, and because, unlike you, I respect commitments. The apartment has been sold, the furniture donated or taken. Gabriel is with me, safe and far away from you. Don't try to find us. You signed documents over the years that you never read carefully. The infidelity clause in our prenuptial agreement was clear, and you violated it repeatedly. Everything that is happening now is legal, documented, and irreversible. You built a life on lies. Now live with the consequences. Beatrice." Richard read the note 3 times, each word digging in like a sharp blade. His hands were shaking so much the paper fluttered before his eyes. He tried calling Beatrice's cell phone. Out of service, he tried again. The same automated message. He called her mother's house upstate. No one answered. He tried her close friends. None of them returned his calls. Desperate, Richard ran down the stairs to the lobby. The new doorman looked at him with a neutral expression. "Where is my wife?" Richard yelled, gripping the counter. "Where is my family?" The doorman, a young man no older than 25, replied with rehearsed calm. "Sir, the owner of the apartment sold the property 3 days ago. She came by on Wednesday to leave the keys with the real estate agency. She said you were already aware of everything." Richard felt the world spin. Owner? But the apartment was in his name. Or so he thought. He staggered back to the empty apartment, sat on the cold living room floor, and began to cry. They weren't tears of remorse or guilt. They were tears of desperation, of humiliation, of a loss of control. Everything he had built, everything he displayed as trophies of his success, had vanished in a matter of days while he was too busy with his own lies. And there, sitting, alone in the apartment that was no longer his, Richard Miller finally understood that he had completely underestimated the woman with whom he had shared 6 years of marriage. Beatrice was not the passive victim he had imagined. She was the architect of his downfall. And the worst part was, Richard had no idea how far she was willing to go to ensure he would never get near her or Gabriel again. Night fell over New York, and Richard remained there, lost in his own wreckage, while somewhere far away, Beatrice held Gabriel in her arms and finally breathed in. The freedom of someone who had broken the chains that bound her to a lie. The next 3 days were a descent into hell for Richard Miller. He stayed in the empty apartment, sitting on the floor, alternating between panic attacks and desperate phone calls that led nowhere. He tried calling everyone Beatrice knew, but it was as if she had vanished from the face of the earth, taking any trace of her whereabouts with her. On the second night, with nowhere to go and no courage to face the reality outside, Richard slept on the cold living room floor, using his suit jacket as a pillow. His thoughts spun in endless circles, trying to understand how this had happened without him noticing. How Beatrice, that sweet and seemingly fragile woman, had orchestrated everything with such precision. It was only on the 3rd day, when hunger forced him out of the apartment, that Richard began to grasp the full extent of what Beatrice had done. He went to a nearby cafe, ordered a sandwich and a coffee, and while he waited, he opened his phone to check social media. What he saw sent a chill down his spine. There were dozens of unread messages, comments on his posts, tags, and they all said basically the same thing. How could you? Liar, hypocrite. You deserve everything that's happening to you. With trembling hands, Richard clicked on one of the notifications and was taken to a post made 3 days earlier by an anonymous account, which already had thousands of shares. The post contained photos of him with Larissa, dining in restaurants, entering hotels, walking hand in hand on South Beach. There were also screenshots of conversations, bank transfer statements to an account he kept separate, receipts for expensive gifts, hotel reservations under false names. It was all there, exposed, public. Every lie he had told, every stolen moment, every broken promise documented in meticulous detail. And the post's caption was simple but devastating. While he was posting pictures of a perfect family, he was living a lie. His wife found out everything, and now he's reaping what he sowed. Richard felt his blood run cold. The coffee he had ordered arrived, but he couldn't swallow. His fingers slid across the phone screen, seeing comment after comment from people he knew. Co-workers, clients, friends from the country club, even distant relatives. All condemning, all judging, no one defending him. How had Beatrice gotten those photos? How did she know everything in such detail? The answer began to form in his mind as he replayed the last few months. The casual questions she would ask, the moments she seemed distracted, but perhaps was just observing. The way she started asking him to confirm schedules and appointments more frequently. Beatrice hadn't been naive. She had been gathering evidence. Richard hastily paid for his coffee and returned to the empty apartment, where he opened his laptop and began searching through emails, documents, anything that could explain what was happening. It was then that he found in his corporate emails spam folder a message sent 2 months ago from a family law firm. The subject was simple: documentation and legal counsel for Beatrice Miller. He opened the email, his heart pounding. It was a confirmation of receipt for documents Beatrice had requested. Copies of their prenuptial agreement, joint bank statements, proof of ownership for the apartment, and a specific clause highlighted in yellow. In the event of proven infidelity by the male spouse, all assets acquired during the marriage will be automatically transferred to the aggrieved party, who will be exempt from any form of asset division. Richard read it over and over, unable to believe it. He vaguely remembered signing that agreement years ago, before the wedding, but he had never actually read the full document. His lawyer at the time had said it was just a formality, something common in marriages between people with significant assets. Richard trusted him and signed. After all, he never imagined Beatrice would have the courage to use it against him, but she had, and she had gone much further. In the days that followed, Richard discovered, piece by piece, how Beatrice had constructed her plan. She hadn't acted on impulse. She wasn't driven by blind rage or emotional despair. She was strategic, calculated, and incredibly patient. It all started 7 months ago, when Beatrice was 6 months pregnant with Gabriel. Richard had gone out for another one of his late-night meetings, and she, feeling nauseous and tired, decided to call his office to ask him to bring home some medicine she had forgotten. The secretary who answered, new to the company and not yet trained to cover her boss's lies, said without thinking that Mr. Miller wasn't there. That he had left around 5 p.m. and wouldn't be back until the next day. In that moment, Beatrice felt something break inside her. She hung up the phone and sat in the living room, her hand on her growing belly, feeling Gabriel move, and understood that she needed to know the truth. The next day, she hired a private investigator, a discreet man, recommended by a lawyer friend, who began to follow Richard. Within 2 weeks, the investigator delivered a complete dossier to Beatrice. Photos of Richard with Larissa, videos of them entering hotels, phone call logs, everything documented with almost surgical precision. Beatrice could have confronted Richard right then. She could have screamed, cried, thrown it all in his face, and demanded an explanation. But she didn't, because Beatrice contrary to what Richard had always believed, was not a woman who acted on uncontrolled emotion. She was rational, and she knew that confronting Richard without a plan would be useless. He would deny it. He would apologize. He would promise to change. And then he would go right back to doing the exact same thing. So Beatrice swallowed her pain. She saved her tears for when she was alone, in the shower, with the water running to muffle her sobs, and she began to plan. First, she contacted the law firm her father had recommended years ago, lawyers specializing in complex divorce cases. She showed them the prenuptial agreement, the evidence of infidelity, and asked what her rights were. The answer was clear. With that evidence, Beatrice could not only divorce Richard without losing anything, but she could also keep the majority of the couple's assets. The apartment, which was in her name due to a tax strategy Richard had implemented years ago, was already legally hers. The joint investments could be divided, but with the infidelity clause, the scales would tip entirely in her favor. Beatrice signed the documents authorizing the lawyers to start preparing everything, but she requested total discretion. She wasn't ready to act yet. Gabriel was about to be born, and she needed to ensure everything was perfectly organized before taking the next step. Over the following months, while Richard continued his double life, oblivious to the storm brewing around him, Beatrice was meticulous. She opened new bank accounts in her name. She discreetly transferred funds from their joint investments into accounts only she controlled. She contacted a trusted real estate agency and put the apartment up for sale, but with a non-disclosure clause until she authorized a public announcement. She began donating or selling the furniture, piece by piece, always when Richard was traveling or busy at the office. She also planned where she would go. She couldn't stay in New York. The city was big, but not big enough to hide someone Richard would be desperate to find. She needed somewhere distant, isolated, where she and Gabriel could start over without the risk of being easily located. That's when Beatrice called Philip, her older brother. Philip was a former Marine, having served for 15 years before retiring and moving to a mountainous region in rural Vermont. He lived on a small property near the Green Mountains, a cold and remote area surrounded by forests and canyons. It was the kind of place Richard would never think to look. Too cold, too isolated, too simple for his standards. Beatrice explained everything to Philip. She showed him the evidence, told him about her plan, and asked for his help. And Philip, who had never liked Richard, who always thought his brother-in-law was arrogant and fake, didn't hesitate. He offered his home, his support, his protection. He told Beatrice that she and Gabriel would always be welcome, and that he would do whatever was necessary to keep them safe. With everything planned, Beatrice just waited for the right moment. And it came when Richard announced his trip to Miami. 5 days, enough time to execute everything. On Monday, as soon as Richard's plane took off, Beatrice sprang into action. She called the moving company she had already hired and authorized them to empty the apartment. Every piece of furniture, every painting, every object was carefully removed, and either donated to charity or stored in a unit she had rented under a fictitious company name. By Wednesday, the apartment was empty. On Thursday, the sale was finalized with the buyers who were already on standby. On Friday morning, Beatrice and Gabriel boarded a bus to Vermont, using documents she had arranged through her lawyers. But before she left, Beatrice made sure to leave one last message. She created an anonymous social media profile and posted all the evidence of Richard's affair, the photos, the bank statements, the conversations, everything. And then she sent copies of the same evidence to Richard's office, to local media outlets, and to some of the consulting firm's biggest clients. She wanted the world to know. She wanted Richard to face public humiliation, because while he was betraying her, he was flaunting the image of a perfect family man, a dedicated father, an exemplary husband on social media. Beatrice wanted to destroy that facade, and she succeeded. Now, sitting in the empty apartment, Richard finally understood the extent of what he had lost, and the worst was yet to come. On the 4th day after his discovery, Richard received a call from Andrew Fisher, his partner. Andrew's voice was tense, almost trembling. "Richard, we need to talk. In person. Now." They met at a discreet cafe far from the office. Andrew arrived with a folder of documents under his arm and an expression Richard had never seen on his face. It wasn't anger, it was deep disappointment. Andrew placed the folder on the table and opened it, revealing bank statements, transfer receipts, and printed emails. "Richard, I didn't want to believe it when I received this," Andrew began, pushing the documents toward him. "But it's all here. You embezzled funds from the company. You used money from corporate accounts to pay for hotels, gifts, trips, all to support your double life." Richard felt the floor give way again. He knew he had mixed some personal expenses with corporate ones, but he always thought he was being discreet enough. He never imagined he would be tracked. "Andrew, I can explain," Richard started, but Andrew held up a hand, cutting him off. "No, I don't want explanations. The other partners have been informed. The internal audit confirmed everything. You're being removed from the firm effective immediately, and you'll have to pay back every cent you took with interest. If you don't do it voluntarily, we'll take legal action." Richard felt his throat tighten. The firm was everything to him, his identity, his status. Without it, he was nobody. "Andrew, please," Richard whispered. "Don't do this. I can fix it. I can." Andrew stood up, picked up the folder, and looked at Richard with a mixture of pity and disgust. "You already had your chance to fix things, Richard. You had thousands of chances, and you chose to waste every single one of them." And with that, Andrew left, leaving Richard alone at the cafe table, his eyes fixed on the empty cup in front of him. In the following days, Richard's downfall accelerated, without the apartment, without his wife, without his son, and now without his job. He found himself completely adrift. The friends who once sought him out for dinners and events now avoided him. No one wanted to be associated with the scandal. Even the clients who once trusted him began cancelling contracts, claiming they could no longer maintain professional relationships with someone whose reputation was so compromised. Richard tried to find Larissa. Maybe she, who always said she loved him, could offer some kind of support. He went to her apartment in Williamsburg, but when he rang the bell, a man he didn't know answered. Larissa didn't live there anymore. She had moved without leaving a forwarding address. Desperate, Richard got her new number from a mutual acquaintance and called. Larissa answered, but her voice was cold, distant. "Richard, don't call me anymore. I want nothing to do with you. You deceived me just as much as you deceived your wife. You said you were about to get a divorce, that you were going to commit to our relationship, and it was all a lie. I saw the news, I saw what you did, and I don't want to be associated with that." Before Richard could respond, Larissa hung up and blocked his number. Richard was alone, completely alone. With no money to pay for a decent hotel, he moved into a cheap hostel in Bushwick. The room was tiny, with a narrow bed, an old locker, and a musty smell that permeated everything. There, surrounded by strangers who had no idea who he was or what he had been, Richard spent his days trying to find a way to rebuild his life. But there was no way. The bridges were burned, the doors were closed, and with each passing day, the reality of his choices weighed more heavily on his shoulders. It was on a particularly difficult night, as Richard lay on the narrow hostel bed, staring at the water-stained ceiling, that he made a decision. He had to find Beatrice. He had to find Gabriel, not because he loved them, not because he felt genuine remorse, but because they were the only thing left of his former life. If he could get them back, maybe he could rebuild something. Maybe he could convince Beatrice to forgive him. Maybe he could use Gabriel to reclaim his family man image. It was a selfish thought, a desperate one. But it was all Richard had. The next morning he spent the last of his money to hire a private investigator. Not the same one Beatrice had used, but one he could afford with the little money left on a still active credit card. The investigator was a middle-aged, bald man with a prominent belly and an office that looked more like a dusty file repository. Richard explained the situation, gave him what information he had on Beatrice, and asked him to find her. The investigator listened in silence, taking notes in an old notebook, and then looked at Richard with a skeptical expression. "Mr. Miller, I'll be honest with you. If your wife planned all this so far in advance, she's not going to be easy to find. But I'll do what I can. It's going to take time and it's going to cost you. Richard nodded, having no other choice. The weeks dragged on. The investigator would call occasionally with updates that led nowhere. Beatrice hadn't used any credit cards. She hadn't made any traceable bank transactions. There were no records of flights or hotel stays. It was as if she had dissolved into thin air. But Richard was stubborn, obsessed. He started doing his own investigations. He scoured the social media profiles of all of Beatrice's acquaintances. He looked for clues in old photos, in comments, in anything that might indicate where she might have gone. It was then that he remembered Philip, her brother, that stern man who rarely appeared at family events and who lived somewhere in the north. Richard called Beatrice's mother, feigning concern and remorse. The woman, still hurt by what her son-in-law had done to her daughter, was cold but eventually let it slip that Philip lived near the Green Mountains in Vermont. She said nothing more, but it was enough. Richard swallowed what was left of his pride, sold the luxury watch he always wore, the last valuable object he still owned, and bought a bus ticket north. The journey would be long, exhausting, but he was determined. He would find Beatrice. He would find Gabriel. And somehow, he would regain control of his life. The bus left New York on a rainy August afternoon. Richard sat by the window, watching the city disappear as the vehicle moved along the highway. He didn't know exactly what he would do when he found Beatrice. He had no clear plan, only the obsession to reclaim what he believed was his by right. But what Richard couldn't know, was that Beatrice was prepared for this moment. She knew he would eventually find out where she was, and she had already taken every necessary precaution to ensure that when that day came, Richard wouldn't be able to take anything from her, ever again. As the bus cut through the night heading north, carrying Richard toward a confrontation he believed he would control, Beatrice was in Vermont, in the isolated cabin Philip had prepared for her, holding Gabriel in her arms and whispering promises that he would never again suffer at the hands of a man like Richard. And for the first time in months, she slept peacefully, knowing she had done everything right, that she had protected herself and her son, and that the man who had betrayed her was finally reaping exactly what he had sown. The small town in Vermont saw few visitors that time of year. The harsh New England winter transformed the region into a landscape of dense fog, biting cold, and a silence that seemed to swallow every sound. Richard got off the bus at the town's small station, carrying only a worn-out backpack with a few clothes and documents. The icy wind hit him like a blade as soon as he stepped onto the platform, and he pulled the thin coat he had bought at a thrift store tighter, inadequate for the climate. The town was everything Richard despised. Small, simple, without the towering skyscrapers or frantic pace of New York. The streets were quiet, almost deserted, with low-slung houses and modest shops. There were no malls, no fancy restaurants, no sign of the cosmopolitan life he was used to. It was exactly the kind of place where Beatrice would know he would never look for her. But there he was, against all odds, willing to do whatever it took. For the first few days, Richard wandered the town trying to gather information. He discreetly asked in small markets, bakeries and gas stations if anyone had seen a young woman with a baby new to the area. The answers were always vague, suspicious. The locals had that reserved manner typical of small towns, where strangers were watched with caution and people protected each other's secrets. With no money to pay for lodging for long, Richard had to find work, something he never imagined he would do. He who had commanded multi-million-dollar meetings, who had signed contracts with multinational corporations, now accepted any manual labor that came his way. He unloaded supply trucks at a warehouse. He helped build a barn on the outskirts of town. He washed dishes at a simple diner. Each day was a humiliation he swallowed in silence because his obsession was greater than his pride. Richard rented a tiny room in the back of an old house where the landlady, a white-haired woman named Mrs. Celia, charged little and asked few questions. The room had only a narrow bed, a decaying wooden wardrobe, and a small window overlooking a yard where chickens pecked among wild plants. The bathroom was shared with other temporary tenants, seasonal workers who came to the area for the fruit harvest or construction jobs. At night, after exhausting days of physical labor that left his body aching and his hands calloused, Richard would sit on the bed and open the old laptop he had bought second-hand. He spent hours scouring social media, local blogs and regional tourism pages, anything that might give him a clue about Beatrice. He created fake profiles to observe without being noticed. He followed pages of local residents, buy and sell groups and forums about the Green Mountains region. It was on a cold September morning, after nearly 2 months of relentless searching, that Richard finally found something. A local photography blog featured landscapes of the area, and in one of the images taken near a well-known peak, there was a detail that made Richard's heart pound. In the corner of the photo, blurry but recognizable, was a woman with her back to the camera, wearing a scarf. It wasn't just any scarf. It was the handmade wool one, in shades of blue and green, that Beatrice's grandmother had knitted years ago. Richard remembered it because Beatrice wore it often, saying it was a precious family heirloom. Richard zoomed in on the image, his heart racing. The woman's back was turned, but her silhouette, the way she held the baby in her arms, it all looked like Beatrice. He checked the location tagged in the photo, near the road leading to the national park, in a remote rural area. Over the next few days, Richard began exploring that region whenever he had free time. He hitched rides on trucks passing by, walked for miles in the piercing cold, and observed isolated houses, cabins, any structure that could shelter Beatrice and Gabriel. The area was vast, with properties scattered among fields and pine forests, but Richard was patient, obsessively patient. It was on an October afternoon, with the sky heavy with dark clouds threatening a storm, that Richard finally saw her. He was sitting at a small roadside stand, drinking a hot coffee to warm up, when an old jeep passed by. At the wheel was a broad-shouldered man with a serious expression, and in the passenger seat, holding Gabriel, was Beatrice. Richard felt the air leave his lungs. It was her, no doubt. Even with her shorter hair and simple clothes he had never seen her wear, it was Beatrice. And Gabriel, bigger than when he had last seen him, was there, alive and healthy. Richard waited for the jeep to disappear down the dirt road before getting up and paying for his coffee. His heart was pounding erratically. Finally, after months of searching, humiliation, and degrading work, he had found her. He followed discreetly, keeping his distance, watching where the jeep went. The dirt road snaked through green fields and then entered a dense forest. After a few miles, the jeep turned onto an almost invisible trail, covered with leaves and branches. Richard mentally noted the location and returned to town. Over the next few days, he planned. He returned to the spot several times, always from a distance, observing their routine. The cabin where Beatrice lived was isolated, surrounded by tall trees, with a simple structure of wood and stone. There was a generator outside, a clothesline with children's clothes, and a pile of firewood covered by a tarp. The man Richard assumed was Philip left in the morning, probably for work or to get supplies in town, and returned in the late afternoon. Richard knew he had to act soon. The winter was getting harsher, and he couldn't endure living in such precarious conditions for much longer. Besides, with each passing day, the risk of being discovered increased. He needed to get Gabriel back. He needed to convince Beatrice to return, or, at the very least, he needed the satisfaction of confronting her, of saying everything that had been stuck in his throat for months. The opportunity came on a stormy night. Richard was returning from work when he saw Philip's jeep parked in front of the town's general store. He watched from a distance as Philip bought groceries, chatted with the owner, and took longer than usual. Richard checked his watch. If Philip was in town now, Beatrice was alone in the cabin, alone with Gabriel. Without a second thought, Richard hitched a ride in a pickup truck heading toward the road that led to the property. He got out a few miles before the trail and continued on foot, using a flashlight he had bought. The rain began to fall heavily, soaking his clothes and turning the ground to mud. Lightning cut across the dark sky, briefly illuminating the path between the trees. When he reached the cabin, Richard was completely drenched and shivering from the cold. He peered through the windows. Inside, Beatrice was sitting near the fireplace, rocking Gabriel in her arms while softly singing a lullaby. The scene was so serene, so far removed from the chaos he was living, that Richard felt a confusing mix of anger, longing, and desperation. He circled the cabin looking for a way in. The front door was locked, but a side window was slightly ajar. Richard forced it open and squeezed through the small gap, landing clumsily on the wooden floor inside. Beatrice turned immediately at the sound, and when her eyes met his, the expression on her face wasn't fear. It was a mixture of disappointment and weariness, as if she had known this moment would eventually come. "Richard," she said, her voice calm despite her racing heart, I knew you'd come." Richard stood up, dripping water on the floor, his hair plastered to his forehead and his eyes fixed on her. "Did you think you could fool me? That you could just disappear and I wouldn't do anything?" Beatrice clutched Gabriel tighter. The baby, startled by the loud voice and the tension in the air, began to whimper. "I didn't fool you, Richard. I did what I had to do to protect us. From you." Richard took a step forward, and Beatrice stood up, backing away slightly. "Protect?" he repeated with a bitter laugh. "You destroyed me, Beatrice. You took everything from me. My job, my home, my reputation. And now you talk about protection?" "I took what you destroyed with your own choices," Beatrice replied, her voice still firm but laced with restrained emotion. "You cheated on me. You lied to me every single day. You built an entire life based on deceit, and when it all came out, instead of taking responsibility, you come after me as if I'm the villain in this story." Richard clenched his fists. Gabriel started crying louder, sensing the tension. "I want my son," Richard said, his voice hoarse. "You can't stop me from seeing my son." "Your son?" Beatrice almost spat the words. "Richard, you were never a real father. You were too busy with your mistress, with your lies, with your inflated ego. Gabriel isn't a trophy you can show off when it's convenient. He's a child who deserves a present, honest father who puts him first. And you were never that man." The words hit Richard like punches, but he didn't back down. "I've changed," he said, his voice breaking. "I've been through hell for months, Beatrice. I lost everything. I worked jobs I never imagined I'd do. I lived in miserable conditions, all to get to you, to have a chance to fix things." Beatrice shook her head, her eyes welling with tears but still firm. "You haven't changed, Richard. You're still only thinking about yourself. You didn't come here because you miss Gabriel or because you want to be a better father. You came because you can't accept that you lost control, because your ego can't stand the idea that I, the woman you underestimated for years, managed to beat you." Richard felt the anger bubble up inside him. It wasn't true. Or was it? He didn't even know anymore. His thoughts were a jumble of months of frustration and despair. "I'm taking Gabriel with me," he said, advancing toward her. "You can't stop me." Beatrice backed up against the wall, but her voice didn't waver. "If you take one more step, I'll scream. Philip is on his way back, and when he gets here, you'll regret it." Richard hesitated. He knew she was right. Philip was a former Marine, probably trained in combat, and Richard, weakened by months of hard labor and poor nutrition, wouldn't stand a chance in a physical confrontation. But his obsession was stronger than reason. He lunged forward and Beatrice screamed. A loud, desperate scream that cut through the night. Gabriel, terrified, burst into tears. And then, as if the universe were answering her despair, the cabin door was kicked open with a violent crash. Philip entered like a hurricane. He had heard the scream as he approached the property and had run the rest of the way. His eyes found Richard immediately, and his face was a mask of controlled fury. "Get out of my house," Philip said, his voice low but charged with menace. Richard turned to face him, his hands still trembling with adrenaline. "This is none of your business. It's between me and my wife." "She's not your wife anymore," Philip replied, advancing. "And you broke into my property. You're scaring my sister and my nephew. So yes, it is my business." Richard looked around, desperate. He had no way out, no plan, nothing but the irrational obsession that had brought him here. "I just want to talk to her," he said, his voice breaking. "I just want a chance." "You had all the chances in the world," Beatrice replied, still holding Gabriel close. "And you wasted every single one. Now leave, Richard. Leave and never come back." Philip moved closer to Richard, and Richard finally understood he was defeated. He took a step back, then another, until he was near the window he had entered through. Philip took out his phone and dialed. "I've already called the police," he said. "They're on their way. You can leave on your own, or you can wait for them to take you." Richard looked at Beatrice one last time. She stood there, holding Gabriel, tears streaming down her face, but with a strength in her eyes he had never seen before. And in that moment, Richard finally understood. He didn't love her. He never truly had. He loved the idea of her, the convenience, the role she played in his perfect life. And now that it had all fallen apart, there was nothing left to love. He walked out the front door, stumbling in the rain that continued to pour. He was walking aimlessly when he saw the red and blue flashing lights of a police car approaching on the dirt road. 2 officers got out, and Philip met them, explaining the situation. Richard didn't even try to run. He had no strength left, no will. The officers approached him, asked for his ID, and questioned him. Richard answered mechanically, without emotion. Philip filed a formal complaint for breaking and entering and making threats. The officers handcuffed Richard and put him in the back of the patrol car. As the car pulled away from the cabin, Richard looked out the rear window and saw Beatrice in the doorway, still holding Gabriel, watching him leave. She wasn't crying anymore. Her face was serene, as if a huge weight had finally been lifted from her shoulders. And Richard, handcuffed and defeated, tasted the bitter reality of true defeat for the first time in months. It wasn't the loss of the apartment, the job, or his reputation. It was the understanding that he had lost the only thing that truly mattered, the chance to be a better person, and now it was too late. The town's police station was small, with just a few cells and a handful of staff. Richard was booked, photographed, and placed in a cold cell that smelled of mold and disinfectant. There, sitting on the concrete bench, he finally let the full weight of reality hit him. There was nowhere left to run, no more excuses, no more lies that could save him. The next morning, a public defender was assigned to his case. The man was young, tired, with a briefcase full of cases and little patience for another domestic dispute. He explained that Richard was facing serious charges, breaking and entering, disturbing the peace, possibly making threats. With the testimonies from Beatrice and Philip, it would be hard to argue innocence. Richard listened in silence. He had no energy to argue, no resources to hire a better lawyer. He was at the mercy of a system that, for the first time in his life, was not on his side. The days in the cell dragged on. Richard shared the space with other temporary detainees, men who had committed petty crimes and were awaiting trial or bail. He slept little, ate even less, and spent his hours staring at the cracked ceiling, replaying every decision that had led him there. It was during one of those bleak mornings that the lawyer returned, this time with an even graver expression. "Mr. Miller, I need to inform you of something important," he said, opening a folder and pulling out documents. "Your ex-wife has presented additional evidence that significantly complicates your situation." Richard looked up, exhausted. "What evidence?" The lawyer hesitated before continuing. "They're medical documents, tests that were conducted a few years ago when you and your wife were trying to conceive. The results show that you have a permanent infertility condition. Mr. Miller, according to these reports, you are biologically incapable of having children." The words took a few seconds to penetrate Richard's mental fog. When he finally understood, he felt as if the floor had vanished from beneath him. "What?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Gabriel," the lawyer continued, "was conceived through artificial insemination with an anonymous donor. Your wife, it seems, chose this method to save your marriage, keeping the procedure a secret to preserve your dignity. She has all the documentation to prove it. And according to state law, since you did not formally adopt the child, and there is no proven biological link, you have no parental rights over Gabriel." Richard felt his world collapse again, but this time in a way he never could have imagined. Gabriel wasn't his son. He never had been. Biologically, legally, emotionally. The last thing he had clung to, the final justification for his obsession, was an illusion. "It can't be," Richard murmured, his hands shaking. Beatrice never told me. She lied." The lawyer sighed. "Mr. Miller, with all due respect, your ex-wife was trying to protect you. She could have revealed this at any time and publicly humiliated you. But she chose to keep the secret, allowing you to believe you were a father, giving you the opportunity to actually be one for Gabriel. Unfortunately, you didn't take that chance." Richard sank onto the concrete bench, his head in his hands. Everything was crumbling. Every pillar he had used for emotional support was being destroyed one by one. First the job, then the reputation. Now even the fatherhood he had never properly valued but still considered his was revealed to be a lie he never even knew he was living. And the worst part was he couldn't blame Beatrice. She had tried to save him. She had kept the secret to protect him, and in return he had betrayed her in the cruelest way possible. The irony was so painful that Richard felt the urge to both laugh and cry. In the following days, while awaiting trial, Richard received more news. Philip and Beatrice had secured a permanent restraining order against him. He could not come within 500 yards of them. Any attempt at contact would result in immediate arrest, and there was more. The documents from the scandal Beatrice had exposed months ago had reached the national press. An investigative journalist from New York, always on the lookout for stories of corporate corruption and unethical behavior, had taken the case and turned it into a series of reports. The story of Richard Miller, the successful executive who led a double life, embezzled corporate funds and was exposed by his own wife, became a headline. Richard became an example, a symbol of what not to do. His mistakes were dissected in articles, podcasts, and television shows. People who had never met him had strong opinions about who he was and what he deserved. And while he languished in a cold cell in rural Vermont, his ex-wife was becoming a voice for women suffering in silence in abusive and manipulative relationships. Beatrice had started writing, not specifically about Richard, but about the experience of discovering betrayal, planning an escape, and rebuilding a life from scratch. Her account, initially posted on an anonymous blog, went viral. Women from all over the country identified with her story. They shared their own experiences. They thanked her for her courage. And there was Richard, on the other side of that story. Not as the protagonist of his own redemption journey, but as the antagonist in someone else's journey of liberation. And there was no going back, no second chance, only the consequences of every selfish choice he had made. When the trial finally took place, Richard was sentenced to pay a heavy fine and serve community service, in addition to having a permanent record of breaking and entering and making threats. He didn't have a prior record that would lead to long-term imprisonment, but his life, as he knew it, was officially over. He walked out of the police station on a cold November morning with nowhere to go, no money, and no prospects. He walked the streets of the small Vermont town, knowing he couldn't stay there any longer. The town now knew who he was, and judgmental stares followed him everywhere. It was time to leave again, to find another place where no one knew him, where he could try to rebuild something from the wreckage. But before leaving town, Richard did one last thing. He wrote a letter, not to Beatrice because he knew she wouldn't read it, but to Gabriel. A letter the boy would only read when he was older, if it ever reached him at all. In it, Richard didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't make empty promises. He just acknowledged his failings. He admitted he had been a terrible father, an even worse husband, and a human being who put his own ego above everyone and everything else. He said that Gabriel deserved so much more than he could ever offer, and that he hoped, genuinely hoped, that the boy would grow up to be everything Richard never was: honest, present, loving. Richard left the letter in a sealed envelope in the town's mailbox, addressed to Philip's cabin. He didn't know if it would arrive. He didn't know if it would be read, but it was all he could do. And then, with just a worn-out backpack and a few coins in his pocket, Richard Miller left the town. He boarded a bus with no specific destination, sat by the window and watched the cold landscape pass by as the vehicle moved down the highway. He didn't know where he was going. He didn't know what he would do. He only knew that the man he had been no longer existed, and maybe, just maybe, that was the beginning of something new. Or maybe it was just the definitive end of everything he had once believed himself to be. 2 years had passed since that stormy night in Vermont. 2 years since Richard Miller had broken into the cabin and been arrested, since he had discovered the truth about Gabriel, since his life had been completely shattered. And in that time the world had moved on, indifferent to the suffering of a man who had engineered his own downfall. Richard now lived in a small town in Ohio, a place whose name he could barely pronounce correctly when he first arrived. He worked at an auto repair shop, fixing old cars and doing maintenance jobs that left his hands permanently stained with grease. The apartment he shared with 2 other workers was cramped, with thin walls that let him hear every neighbor's conversation, every fight, every moment of someone else's intimacy. There were no more Italian suits, no more Swiss watch, no more dinners at sophisticated restaurants or trips to Miami. There was only the exhausting routine of waking up early, working hard, and coming home too late to do anything but shower and sleep. He had tried to change his name, to start completely fresh, but the bureaucratic and financial effort was beyond his means. So he learned to live with the weight of his own story, avoiding deep conversations, keeping people at a distance, never allowing anyone to get close enough to ask about his past. On some nights, when the loneliness was too much to bear, Richard found himself thinking about Beatrice and Gabriel, not with the sick obsession of before, but with a mixture of regret and resignation. He wondered how the boy was doing, if he was talking yet, if he was walking, if he had Beatrice's eyes or those of the anonymous donor, who was his true biological father. Richard knew he would never know the answers. He knew he had lost any right to know. And that knowledge ached in a quiet way that never fully went away. There were moments, especially in the first year after leaving Vermont, when Richard considered getting in touch, writing a letter, trying somehow to ask for forgiveness, not to be forgiven, but simply to put into words the weight he carried. But every time he picked up a pen and paper, the words failed him. What could he say? Sorry for destroying our family? Sorry for lying for years? Sorry for being an absent father to a child who wasn't even biologically mine, but whom I should have loved unconditionally? None of those words seemed sufficient, so Richard put the paper away and continued living his small, quiet life, devoid of any glamour or meaning beyond simple survival. Beatrice, on the other hand, had blossomed in ways she never could have imagined. In the first few months after the confrontation, she had remained at Philip's cabin, surrounded by the unforgiving nature of the North, focusing all her energy on caring for Gabriel and rebuilding her own identity. It wasn't easy. There were nights when the fear returned, when she would wake up sweating, imagining Richard forcing the door open again. But Philip was always there, a pillar of silent strength, ensuring she and his nephew were safe. It was during these restless nights that Beatrice began to write. Initially, they were just notes in an old journal, scattered thoughts about her journey, about what she had learned, about how she had found the courage to do what many women dreamed of but couldn't. But as the weeks passed, these notes transformed into something bigger, complete stories, deep reflections, an honest, unfiltered account of what it was like to discover that the life you had built was based on lies. A lawyer friend who had followed Beatrice's entire legal process suggested she publish anonymously on a blog, just to see if other women would relate. Beatrice hesitated at first, but eventually agreed. She created a profile under the pseudonym Anna B. and posted the first chapter of her story. The response was overwhelming. Within a week, the post had hundreds of comments. Women from all over the country, and even from other English-speaking countries, shared their own experiences. They talked about unfaithful husbands, about years of emotional manipulation, about the fear of leaving abusive relationships, about the courage they saw in Beatrice's story and wished to find in themselves. Encouraged, Beatrice kept writing, chapter after chapter. Not just about Richard, but about everything. About how she discovered the affair, about the process of planning her escape, about the nights she cried alone while pretending everything was fine, about the strength she found in unexpected places, about the freedom she felt when she finally broke the chains. Within 6 months, Anna B's blog had thousands of followers, And that's when a publisher contacted her. They wanted to turn her story into a book, a complete account, still under a pseudonym if she preferred, that could reach even more women. Beatrice accepted. The book was launched on a sunny spring afternoon at a charming bookstore in Boston. Beatrice attended the launch but kept her identity protected, wearing a light veil and introducing herself only as Anna B. The book was called Screaming Silences, and its cover featured a minimalist image of a woman with her back to the camera, looking toward the horizon. Sales started modestly, but word of mouth did its work. Women bought the book, read it, cried, saw themselves in its pages, and recommended it to others. In 3 months, Screaming Silences was on the bestseller list. In 6 months, it was being translated into other languages. Within a year, Beatrice received invitations for lectures, podcasts, and television shows. She accepted some, always maintaining her anonymity, always focusing not on Richard as the villain, but on the journey of self-discovery and liberation. Because for Beatrice, the story was never really about him. It was about her, about all the women who lived in silence, carrying pains no one saw, propping up relationships that were destroying them from the inside. The money that started coming in from royalties and speaking engagements allowed Beatrice to move out of Philip's cabin and rent a small but cozy house in a suburb of Boston. Nothing ostentatious, nothing that drew attention, but a real home for her and Gabriel. A place with a yard where the boy could play, a living room filled with natural light where Beatrice could write, and rooms decorated with photos of a real family, not the sham she had lived with Richard. Gabriel grew up healthy and happy. At 3, he was a cheerful, energetic child who loved to draw and play with the neighbors' dogs. He had no memories of Richard. He didn't know that the man he sometimes saw in old photos, before Beatrice stored them for good, in a box at the back of a closet, had caused so much pain. For Gabriel, family was his mother, his Uncle Philip, who visited whenever he could, his grandmother who came down from upstate from time to time, and the friends who were part of his small, safe world. Beatrice never spoke ill of Richard to Gabriel. When the boy, in his childlike innocence, asked about his father, she would gently explain that his father had needed to follow a different path, but that he was deeply loved by her and everyone around him. Beatrice knew that one day she would have to tell the whole truth, but for now, protecting Gabriel's innocence was her priority. The book's success also brought responsibilities. Beatrice was invited to be a consultant for a non-profit organization that worked with women who were victims of domestic violence and abusive relationships. She accepted but kept her involvement discreet, offering guidance based on her own experience without revealing her real identity. She donated a significant portion of the book's profits to related causes, even creating a small support fund for women who needed to leave dangerous relationships but lacked the financial resources. One of those women was Larissa. Ironically, a year and a half after the events that destroyed Richard's life, Larissa had sought help from the non-profit where Beatrice was a consultant. She was in an abusive relationship with a businessman who manipulated her financially and emotionally, and she needed help to get out. Beatrice, who didn't initially know who the woman was, advised the organization's professionals on how to proceed. It was only months later, when Larissa was safe and rebuilding her life, that Beatrice discovered the connection. She could have felt anger. She could have refused to help the woman who had been complicit in Richard's betrayal. But Beatrice had learned something fundamental during her journey. Blaming other women for men's failings was to miss the real problem. Larissa had also been a victim of manipulation. Richard had lied to her just as much as he had lied to Beatrice. And now they were both on the same side, fighting to rebuild their lives away from men who saw them as objects, not people. When Beatrice finally revealed who she was to Larissa in a discreet meeting at a Boston cafe, the young woman was in shock. She apologized repeatedly, tears streaming down her face, saying she never imagined the damage she was causing, that Richard had painted a completely different picture of reality. Beatrice accepted the apology, not because she thought Larissa was blameless, but because she understood that holding a grudge would be giving Richard more power over her life than he deserved. She and Larissa didn't become friends, but they developed a mutual respect, two survivors of the same storm who were now helping other women find shelter. Meanwhile, in his small Ohio town, Richard read about the book's success in the old newspapers they used at the shop to line the floor while they worked. He didn't know it was about Beatrice. The pseudonym and the vague description of the story didn't make it clear, but something inside him recognized familiar elements. The narrative of a woman who meticulously planned her escape from a marriage built on lies. The account of discovering betrayal and turning pain into strength. It could have been any story, but Richard felt it was his, or rather, Beatrice's story of how she escaped him. He bought the book with the little money he had left at the end of the month, read it, in 2 sleepless nights, and when he finished, he cried for the first time in years. They weren't tears of self-pity, but of recognition. Every word Anna B. wrote was a truth he had refused to see when he had the chance. Every reflection was a mirror, showing him exactly who he had been. Richard never tried to find out if Anna B. was really Beatrice. He didn't have the courage, and even if he did, what would he do with that information? She had made it very clear, in every possible way, that he was no longer a part of her life, and Richard, for the first time, respected that. In the years that followed, their lives continued on parallel paths that would never cross again. Beatrice published a second book. This one focused on rebuilding and empowerment. She partnered with therapists and mental health professionals to create workshops for women. She became a respected voice, still under her pseudonym, in debates about healthy relationships and how to identify signs of emotional manipulation. Gabriel grew up strong and healthy, surrounded by true love. At 5, he started asking more elaborate questions about his father, and Beatrice, with the help of a child psychologist, began to gently introduce the truth. That his biological father was a donor who had helped bring him into the world. That the man who had been present at the beginning of his life had made bad choices and had to follow a different path. And that none of it changed how much he was loved and wanted. Richard, for his part, found a strange kind of peace in his simple life. It wasn't happiness, not in the traditional sense, but it was a sort of acceptance. He no longer tried to rebuild the empire he had lost. He didn't seek revenge or justifications. He worked, saved what he could, and tried to be a minimally decent person in his daily interactions. He helped his elderly neighbors with small repairs. He occasionally donated to child protection charities. They were small gestures, perhaps insignificant in the grand scheme of things, but they were all he had to offer. One winter evening, 5 years after leaving Vermont, Richard received an unexpected call. It was Andrew Fisher, his former partner. The voice on the other end was older, tired, but still recognizable. "Richard," Andrew said without preamble, "I know. There's nothing between us anymore, but I thought you should know. Your name has finally been cleared from the pending lawsuits. You've paid all your debts to the firm. Legally, you're free." Richard gripped the phone tightly, processing the information. Free. Financially, at least. Morally, emotionally, he knew he would never be completely free from the weight of his actions. "Thanks for letting me know," Richard said, his voice hoarse. There was a pause on the other end. Then Andrew continued more softly. "Richard, I don't know if this matters to you, but I hope you found some kind of peace. I really do." "I'm trying," Richard replied. "Every day." Andrew hung up, and Richard sat in his small apartment, staring at the phone in his hands, free from financial debts, but forever bound to the consequences of who he had been. Beatrice never knew about that call. She never knew that Richard was trying in his own broken and limited way to be better. And maybe it was for the best, because her story wasn't about his redemption, it was about her liberation. On Gabriel's 7th birthday, Beatrice threw a small party in their backyard. There was chocolate, cake, colorful balloons, school friends running and laughing, and a sense of genuine joy that permeated everything. She watched Gabriel open his presents, his eyes shining with happiness, and felt a deep gratitude for everything she had achieved. Philip was there, along with her mother and a few close friends. It wasn't a grand party like the ones Beatrice used to organize when she was with Richard, trying to keep up the appearance of a perfect family. It was simple, authentic, and filled with real love. That night, after everyone had gone home and Gabriel was sleeping soundly in his room, Beatrice sat in the yard with a cup of tea, looking at the stars that dotted the Boston sky. She thought about everything she had been through, the lies, the pain, the meticulous planning of her escape, the fear, the strength she found when she needed it most. And she thought of Richard, not with anger, not anymore, but with a kind of distant sadness for a man who had everything and threw it all away because he never learned to value what truly mattered. She wondered where he was, if he had changed, if he had learned anything from what had happened. But then she shook her head, took a sip of her warm tea and let those thoughts go. Because Richard was no longer part of her story. He was just a chapter, a painful but necessary one that had taught her about strength, about boundaries, about self-love. And now that chapter was closed. Beatrice looked at the lit-up house behind her, where Gabriel slept safe and loved. She looked at the garden she had planted herself, at the flowers that were beginning to bloom even in the harsh winter. She looked at the life she had built from scratch, alone with her own hands and her own determination, and she smiled. Because the real victory wasn't destroying Richard. It was rebuilding herself. It was proving that she was much stronger than anyone, including herself, had ever imagined. It was creating a space where Gabriel could grow without the shadows of lies and manipulation. It was turning pain into purpose, suffering into strength, silence into a voice. Years later, when Gabriel turned 15, and Beatrice finally told him the whole truth about Richard, about the betrayal, about the escape, about everything, the boy hugged her tightly and said, "Mum, thank you for being strong enough to save us." And in that moment, Beatrice knew that every difficult decision, every night of fear, every hidden tear had been worth it. Richard Miller never became the man he could have been. He lost his family, his reputation, his life of luxury, but more importantly, he lost the opportunity to be part of the life of a child who would have loved him unconditionally if he had chosen to be present, chosen to be honest, chosen to be a real father. Beatrice, on the other hand, became so much more than she had ever dreamed. She didn't just survive, she thrived. She turned her pain into the strength of hundreds of other women. She created a legacy of courage and hope. And most importantly, she gave Gabriel the childhood he deserved, full of love, truth, and security. The moral of Richard and Beatrice's story isn't about revenge or punishment. It's about choices, about how every decision we make either builds or destroys not only our own lives, but the lives of everyone around us. It's about how lies, no matter how well constructed, eventually crumble, and about how the truth, no matter how painful, is always the most solid foundation on which to rebuild. Richard built his life on lies, and when the foundation cracked, everything collapsed. Beatrice took the rubble of what was left and built something new, stronger and truer. And in that difference, in that fundamental choice between continuing to lie or embracing the painful truth, lies the entire difference between sinking and thriving. Because in the end, it doesn't matter how high you climb if the ladder is leaning on sand. It doesn't matter how beautiful the facade is if the structure behind it is rotten. And it doesn't matter how many excuses you invent if deep down you know you're wrong. Richard's life is a reminder that when we build on lies, the foundation cracks, and the people we think are fragile, whom we underestimate, whom we believe will never have the courage to confront us, are sometimes the very ones who are just waiting for the right moment to show us who they really are. And when that moment comes, there's no going back, no second chance. There are only the consequences of the choices we've made, echoing through the rest of our lives. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Beatrice and Richard has deeply touched your hearts. If you were moved by Beatrice's journey of courage and rebuilding, if you recognize the importance of valuing the people we love, if you reflected on the weight of the choices we make every day, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments what part of this story resonated with you the most. Every day, we bring you intense narratives like this one, revealing the deepest side of the human soul, making us question our own lives and inspiring us to be better people. Which part of Beatrice's story touched you the most? Do you know someone who has gone through a similar journey? Share your story in the comments, because every account is a way to give a voice to those who are still suffering in silence. We'll see you in the next episode with another story that will move, provoke, and transform. Until then, take care of the ones you love, be honest with yourself, and always remember, the truth, no matter how painful, is always stronger than any lie. A big hug from our entire team, and thank you for being part of this journey with us.